For this session, we would like to invite Prof. Nilesh Kumar to introduce the speaker and moderate the session.
Good morning and welcome to the third day of 10th Learning Resources Festival 2022 at International Medical University. The theme of this festival is Humanizing Technology via Education. We are very honored to welcome our speaker of the day, Sin Michael Morris, for the keynote speech on Humanizing Digital Pedagogy. Let me introduce Mr. Sin Michael Morris. Some of you may be knowing that Course Hero is an American education website that was founded in 2006 and provides an online platform for over 20 million students. As Vice President Academics, Sin leads Course Hero's educator team and initiatives. Sin has 20 years of experience in academia and is an expert in student-centered learning and critical digital pedagogy. Sin has been working as senior instructor in learning design and technology at the University of Colorado before joining Course Hero. He co-founded Digital Pedagogy Lab and co-authored a book titled An Urgency of Teachers, the Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy. Please give a warm applause and welcome Mr. Sin Michael Morris. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very honored to be here. I loved the opening ceremony. That was wonderful. It was really good to see that and see what you all have been up to for 10 years. As someone who speaks at conferences relatively often, I often don't get a sense of the history of a conference or the sort of importance to those who continue to put it on, and I appreciated seeing all of that. That was really wonderful. I used to run my own conference, and I ran that for about 8 years. Well, I guess we ran it for almost 10 years, and it was always a lot of work, and it was definitely a project full of love and joy. So I appreciate everything you're doing here. I'm going to share my screen really quickly, so I can show you my slides. I'm just going to assume that everyone can see that, and I'll go forward here. It's always. I'll start off by saying it's always humbling to do this at any point for any conference, and especially I think since we've all gone virtual and conferences have gone virtual. It feels like an incredible opportunity to be able to speak to audiences I would never get to speak to otherwise, and I'm always humbled by the opportunity. So I appreciate being here. Thank you very much. So back in 2021, I found myself. Hold on one second here. Something's not working with my slides. There we go. In 2021, I found myself divorced and back on the singles scene. And it's a strange world out there these days. The last time I was single was before the iPhone, before apps, before Instagram, TikTok, before dating apps. And as a 52-year-old man, whose past partnerships were based on what could be described as a slow courtship, the notion of meeting somebody just as quickly as and on the same device as I could post a tweet on Twitter was novel and not a little troubling in its novelty. There are conversations you can have on these apps, these dating apps, conversations that can go any number of directions depending on who's on the other side of the screen. And in some apps, you get to know how close or far away the person is that you're talking to. Sometimes that's a matter of a few hundred feet. Sometimes it's only an acknowledgement that you're both somewhere in the same city. It gives the interaction a sense of being visceral, of being physical and close. And yet the interaction remains fundamentally digital. A selection of still photographs, brief text exchanges, emojis. And there's never any telling what's happening behind the screen for the person you're talking to. They could be having multiple conversations while also talking to you, or they could be showing your conversation to their roommate, or they could be making dinner, inattentive to your latest message. A pause between messages could mean anything. And the longer the pause, the more likely the conversation will pass into oblivion and just never continue. As physical, visceral, sensory people, digital technology raises in us a kind of primordial fear of the unknown, no matter how good we get at delivering ourselves via text or how well we perfect our Zoom persona, and no matter how well we master all the apps. When our interactions are distant, they are subject to silences, and reaching out into that silence to say, "Are you there?" feels vulnerable and risky. In education, too often, instead of being vulnerable and taking risks, we implement rules of engagement. We require students to turn their cameras on. We compel discussion by browbeating students with rubrics for interaction. We use remote proctoring software so that no matter where we are or no matter where they are, we can ensure that students keep their heads down when taking tests. We find all manner of methods to guarantee that they won't cheat. Can you imagine if we did that with other humans in our lives? I don't think that would go over very well. Which is why part of the secret to humanizing the digital is asking, are you there? And waiting, waiting, waiting for the answer. Put briefly, critical digital pedagogy is an educational philosophy based on the work of Paulo Freire and on how that work encounters digital education. So as I go on, I'm going to freely interchange critical pedagogy and critical digital pedagogy because I want to recognize that the principal qualities of each are the same. Critical pedagogy and subsequently critical digital pedagogy should not be understood as teaching methods. First and foremost, these are pedagogies focused on the understanding of power, agency, oppression, and how change happens. Best practices associated with critical pedagogies are vague, more in line with the notion of ethos rather than practice, which is not to say that critical pedagogy is entirely theoretical. On the contrary, critical pedagogy and critical digital pedagogy are wholly concerned with action. It may seem that the pedagogist sits back and scans the horizon of education for new things to talk about, but that could not be farther from the truth. The critical pedagogist is one whose practice undergoes constant revision in the interests of creating greater and more effective means for students and other humans to thrive. Chandra Mohanty has said that critical pedagogy attempts to link knowledge, social responsibility, and collective struggle, and it does so by emphasizing the risks that education involves, the struggles for institutional change, and the strategies for challenging forms of domination. The necessity for education is key to the practices of critical pedagogy, but it's important to see that traditional educational models are often what the critical pedagogist resists. Paulo Freire specifically addressed what he called the banking model of education. And he writes in chapter 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed that the teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Or else he expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students. His task is to fill the students with the contents of his narration. Narration, with the teacher as narrator, leads the students to memorize mechanically the narrated content. Worse, it turns them into containers, into receptacles to be filled by the teacher. The more completely she fills the receptacles, the better the teacher she is. And the more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. Education thus becomes an act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. Here, what we're witnessing is Freire's critical analysis of the roles of teacher and student, roles which are perpetuated by both classroom methodologies and educational technologies today. He later goes on to advocate for a problem-posing education, one which actively involves the learner in a process of understanding the world around them. In this case, Freire argues for a solution to the power relationship between teacher and student, suggesting that each become each. So student teachers and teacher students. One important thing to note, though, is that throughout his argument, Freire is not calling for the dismantling of schools, but for the dismantling of the patterns of power in schools. Those relationships of power are the most interesting thing to the critical pedagogist and to the critical digital pedagogist, both in terms of who is dealt it and in terms of how it is wielded. Now, I want to return to the idea of silence that I brought up before, and what happens when we ask, "Are you there?" and wait for the response, because silences online are moments of relative powerlessness. For example, if I were to ask if anyone has a question, which may happen at the end of this presentation, and no one responds, I just sit here in silence waiting for a response. And in a class, unless we create rules and punitive consequences for engagement, we cannot force a response faster than it will come. And here again, I'll compare how we behave towards someone we're chatting up on like a dating app and students learning at a distance. While the quality of the communication is different and the responsibility behind the engagement are not at all the same, the very human uncertainty while waiting in silence for an answer can be very similar. Writing a discussion prompt or sending an email to a student and then waiting on a reply is in this way not so very different from waiting by the phone for someone to message you. Silence has power and silence has vulnerability. That person maintaining the silence wields the power, and that person waiting on a response is subject to that power. Knowing that, critical pedagogy looks at the relationship between the silent person and the person listening for an answer for clues about agency, oppression, and what change might be needed to make that relationship more democratic. And the answers aren't always what you might expect. Traditional teaching methods would do everything possible to remove the student's power to be silent, giving control of dialogue to the teacher. But critical pedagogy might reflect on the meaning of silence, the power that the listener can have, such that as Freire advocates for teacher students and student teachers, we might see a new configuration of power where silence and listening share something in their anticipation of the other. I say all of this because the goals of critical pedagogy and also critical digital pedagogy are often mistaken as advocating for tearing everything down and starting over, burning down the institutions that wield power and building up something new in their place. What this assumption of critical pedagogies overlooks, though, is that burning down an institution is also an act of wielding power without regard for those who might suffer. Taking power away is not the goal of critical pedagogy. Rather, understanding and making democratic patterns of power is the goal. Sorry, I keep losing track of my slides. The banking model of education can be dismantled without getting rid of the lecture. A teacher can remain at the front of the room and also empower students to grasp hold of their agency and take control of their learning. In fact, differential relationships of authority, those where both student and teacher do and do not have authority, provide the most fertile environment for agency. And thinking in these more nuanced ways, in terms of critical digital pedagogy, we can look at the banking model of education in a couple of ways. First, we can see it as Freire witnessed it. A teacher dispensing knowledge to empty vessel students whose only job is to absorb the teacher's expertise. And that certainly happens often enough in digital learning. But we can also look at the banking model in terms of the technologies we use to deliver education at a distance. Take, for instance, the learning management system. In an article I wrote called Reading the LMS Against the Backdrop of Critical Pedagogy, I spend some time analyzing the Canvas learning management system, or LMS, looking at how it reinforces the banking model of education. I write in that article, in some of my talks with leadership at Instructure in the early days of the Canvas LMS, they seemed very much in agreement with me about ideas like student agency, identity, empowerment, student-centered classrooms, and the like. They hoped that their LMS made room for teachers to adopt all kinds of pedagogies, including critical pedagogy. These were exciting discussions, and the first I'd heard of an educational technology company that was truly interested in education and not just technology. However, in those discussions, we were skipping upon the surface of the water. In order for an LMS or any educational technology to function, it must assume itself integral to the learning process. It must operate as a determinant in education. The makers of Canvas couldn't look at their product as optional, nor could they build a container for learning that invited students to question the notion that learning can even be contained. In other words, the very existence of this particular educational technology obfuscates or entirely wipes out the opportunity for any but a banking model of teaching. The technology itself dispenses information through its design. Put another way, technology instructs the teacher how to teach. All digital technologies do this, tell us how to use them. Their designs are either arbitrary. Why is a tweet 240 characters? Why do we swipe left or right on dating apps? Or if not arbitrary, they are derivative of other similar technologies. Either way, we don't have any say in how they work. Technologies are the teachers at the front of the room when it comes to digital education, and they assume teachers are empty receptacles waiting to be filled with instructions about how to interact in digital spaces. And we have no choice but to believe in their functionality, which stands in for expertise. During the pandemic and continuing on today, as we all had to turn to remote and online teaching, educational technologies have been adopted rapidly and without looking critically at how they impact teaching and learning. Most of us have literally had to take it on faith that these technologies can solve the problems that surprised us in 2020. And even when they fail to do so, we've had to persevere. One thing that has been a crucial factor in our struggles against the move to online learning in 2020 have been this concept of silence that I keep talking about, of a lack of an answer from the other side of the screen. And this is where the existential crisis for education in the pandemic really arose. If students are meant to be receptacles of the narration of education, if they are only good students insofar as they allow themselves to be filled up by that narration, then what happens when educators are no longer able to see that exchange happen? This has been, honestly, the crisis for online learning since the beginning, and for correspondence education before that. How do I know, asks the teacher, that students are learning if I can't see them? How do I know they're listening or reading or viewing my video lectures? And if they're not doing that, how can they be learning anything? What the pandemic brought to the foreground of digital learning was not that there needed to be better tools for surveilling students, for checking up on them to be sure they were being good little receptacles, although there was a vigorous interest in those tools, but rather that we as educators had no idea how to reach out across the distance to students we couldn't see. And even the very idea of reaching across the distance imperiled our notions of how learning happens, how it must happen if it's to follow the rules of education. And as a response, many of us made up more rules. Rules about turning on cameras, rules about attendance in digital space, rules about taking tests, and rules about engaging in discussion. These rules utterly ignored the distance and its attendant silence, which was the greatest lesson we could have learned. Because those of us who were able to bear through the distance and stand against the silence discovered that students were not okay. We discovered that the real challenges facing education were not whether the rules were being followed or the receptacles being filled. We discovered that the real peril lie in problems with accessibility and considerations of disability that are specific to online teaching and learning, and the way in which traditional teaching methods and approaches tend to gloss over trauma or ignore it completely. We found out that there was a general lack of good digital pedagogies that reinforce and hold up the human person and their needs, and the overall dearth of solid, meaningful, professional development available to faculty. Professional development that goes beyond the advice about putting images in your course and creating video lectures, and that really tries to tackle what it means to teach online. And these revelations came from putting aside the need to surveil and replacing it with the need to check in, to ask, "Are you there?" and listen to the silence, anticipating an answer. What we've learned is that we need a different approach, one which, frankly, we haven't yet imagined, but one which doesn't require students to be the receptacles of the narration of education, and that doesn't insist that they are only good students insofar as they allow themselves to be filled by that narration. We need some way of teaching across the distance, of teaching through the screen, that allows for students to capably live their lives while integrating their education into those lives. One thing that I'm often asked is the question of, how do we do this humanizing education thing? How do we learn to reach out across the silence through the screen and change the way we teach? In a little bit, I'm going to move into talking about education, or excuse me, I'm going to move into talking about imagination, which I think is really the answer to all these questions of how. But ultimately, my best advice for teaching online is stop thinking about being online. No learning happens online. It all happens in a real place somewhere, where there are hands and fingers, feet and toes, a breathing person with a heartbeat whose eyes blink more quickly when they think hard. Put space in your teaching, because there is space in the relationship to students. The immediacy of the classroom online is no longer an affordance. So take the most advantage you can of the more gentle continuity that distance provides. Also, don't believe the tools you're given. There is no technology that knows how to teach or how to build a relationship. We've never coded for kindness or understanding or compassion or compromise. And those things are vital when establishing the connection between student and teacher. Students need to be more than faces on an app that we can swipe left or right and give them a grade. And finally, I encourage you to think about how education itself is a technology that needs constant maintenance. We shouldn't have needed a pandemic to point out certain weaknesses or flaws in the system, and we shouldn't have needed a pandemic to remind us to humanize education. But now that we've learned these lessons, let's keep an eye on the machine. And perhaps, as Henry David Thoreau might say, let our work be a counter friction to that machine, for students' sake and for the sake of our own humanity. Now, most people don't expect me to start talking about imagination, but this has become really key to the way that I approach critical pedagogy and the way that I approach teaching and learning. I love the idea of imagination. I've said in the past that it is a human faculty as accurate as the intellect. I've also attributed it as having a key role in the kind of revolutionary change making that critical pedagogy calls for. And I think these are both true about the imagination, but maybe the truest thing for me is that the imagination intrigues me and has intrigued me since from the time I was a small child. My mother told me, never lose your imagination. For a child, the idea of losing your imagination is akin to losing your sense of taste, your ability to look up, your understanding of birthdays. Today, told that I should not lose my imagination, I understood two things. First, that the imagination is powerful, meaningful, and second, it can be lost. And it was probably lost the more adult one became. So as young as the second grade, I began to try to cling to this apparatus, which was natural to my everyday life, which I couldn't really conceive of, but which I hoped one day to understand so as not to lose it. It was a thing I had in abundance, according to my mother, but which I could not separate out from any other part of my life. I recall that my mother used to keep me from school on certain days to engage in imaginative play and activities, and running through the very rare fog on Colorado mornings, planting a rock garden outside our house in a small plot next to the driveway, hiking off trail in the Rockies. The imagination was tied to creativity, but it was also tied to play. And importantly, the imagination could also be found in reading. And my mom found occasions aplenty for me to read Dickens and Shakespeare, Walt Whitman, and Robert Frost, and Emily Dickinson. And in between their words were worlds revealed by closing my eyes and listening carefully. As an adult now, I recognize that the imagination is never lost. We continue to imagine the ways adults do, looking for the perfect career, that one relationship, the elusive idea of retirement. But the imagination as we knew it as children is generally not included in our adult lives and can even be disparaged. Scholarship of the imagination is not common, nor is it given heft next to evidence-based research. We don't lose our imagination as we get older, but we decenter it. We don't give it priority. Maxine Green, an arts educator whose work brings critical pedagogy and imagination into close conversation, said that the imagination gives us the capacity to see things as they might be otherwise. For me, this certainly was the dream of listening to Shakespeare, not just the narrative, the humor, the characters, but the history. To imagine castles and wars and kingdoms, ancient wars so far past they were myths even during Shakespeare's time. This was to imagine a world otherwise from the one that I occupied. One where I was too little to reach the top shelf, and bullies harangued me during my lunch hour at school, and where I longed to be grown up so I could travel to the castles and the moors and the kingdoms. The imagination inspires movement. As Northrop Frye writes in The Educated Imagination, in the world of the imagination, anything goes that is imaginatively possible, but nothing really happens. If it did happen, it would move out of the world of imagination and into the world of action. And it's this idea of moving out of the world of imagination and into the world of action that catches me and that helps me understand why we should reconsider the priority we give it. Because the imagination can be the root of action, of change, of seeing things not just as they are, but as they might be. And that might be is what my mother was trying to give me all along. Don't lose your might be. Don't believe this little world they invented for us. Imagine a better one. That's where imagination becomes important to digital pedagogy and distance learning, in our imaginative capacity to see that things not only can be otherwise, but that they must be. Teaching at a distance cannot be the same as teaching in a walled classroom, and yet how we've approached digital pedagogies has been primarily an unimaginative attempt to replicate that classroom experience on the surface of a screen. The problem with most digital pedagogies today is that they primarily equate to design, instructional design, universal design, inclusive design. These are the pedagogies we get to choose from. But each of these refers to teaching on a screen, not through a screen. Moreover, as vital as designs which embrace issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are, the exercise of those designs has beneath it an underlying pedagogy that goes unquestioned. The mastery of content is the goal of learning. It's the banking model all over again. That what we upload as teachers and designers is what students should download. What we can make sure that all our images have alt text and our syllabus includes work by marginalized voices in the field. And we absolutely must do these things because it's far past time. But these steps do not imagine a teaching that reaches through the screen. Design always sits upon a screen. Design transmits, and most usually just one direction. Seymour Papert once wrote that most honest schoolers are locked into the assumption that school's way is the only way because they have never seen or imagined convincing alternatives to impart certain kinds of knowledge. Almost all experiments in purporting to implement progressive education have been disappointing because they simply did not go far enough in making the student the subject of the process rather than the object. It's very, very difficult to craft a design to make the student the subject of the learning process. It's also very, very easy. But what it takes is a willingness to step away from assumptions about education that have kept digital design and pedagogy from being practices of freedom. Endlessly worrying over consistency, over trappings like elaborate rubrics and rules for participation that we have been convinced are necessary to ensure the learning is happening only leads to making students objects of the process in increasingly complex ways. But if we can stop ourselves from making things complicated, I'm reminded of a recent surge of conversation around the notion of ungrading. And Susan Bloom writes in her introduction to the edited collection on ungrading that though grading seems natural, inevitable, a part of the very fabric of school, it isn't. It was created at a certain moment for certain reasons not entirely well thought out, and then became embedded into the structures of schools for most students. But because we invented it, we can uninvent it. We can remove it. This is a good start to a really good book that aims to ask some important questions. Ungrading works to reverse the damage to learners and learning that years of grading or marking has done, the kind of damage which Peter Elbow refers to when he writes, grading tends to undermine the climate for teaching and learning. Once we start grading their work, students are tempted to study or work for the grade rather than for learning. The problem with ungrading is that it can quickly become a best practice. And as soon as that happens, defining, delimiting methods begin to underlie what was meant to be a practice of freedom. Consider even briefly the commonest kind of faculty development for online teaching. Training usually consists of best practices like including pictures and videos, how to name files, the famous post once, reply twice advice or managing discussion fora, how to use innovative apps, Flipgrid, Quizlet, Camtasia, and the rest. Design pedagogies too often point to the how and outcomes of the practice without looking for the root cause of the problem they're trying to solve, without asking why. And not the instructional why, and not the evidence-based why, but the why, as in, why a video lecture? Why a lecture? Wait, why my voice at the front of the room? Critical thinking and imagination both rise from the process of asking why, asking it over and over again like a 4-year-old, until we get to our reasons for doing things. It's at that point that we can recognize the problem that's posed. In the case of ungrading, when we ask why again and again, we don't necessarily stop at the point when we recognize that grades have damaged learning and learners. If we keep going, we may discover that grading is itself an outgrowth of pedagogies of dominance and control, and that that's the problem we need to solve. And this is the moment when in our process when imagination becomes most valuable. Faced with an issue that seems profoundly, irredeemably systemic, we might just throw up our hands and go back to grading. But the imagination comes in and asks us, how can things be otherwise? The imagination allows us to dream up something that does not yet exist, something that doesn't need to be predicated on this little world they've invented for us, the way that ungrading is predicated on grading. Now, I've taken us kind of down a theory rabbit hole. And while I advocate for doing this kind of deep critical analysis of education and of imagining an education that is otherwise, I also want to emphasize the why for this approach, and that is to create a humanizing pedagogy. Even when our work seems to happen upon a screen, it can and must keep humans in mind, and more than in mind, at the forefront, the subject of the process rather than the object. Papert's idea of going far enough relies upon a willingness to employ imagination at the outset of teaching. At that point, when we move toward the screen and begin to work there. This is when it is so important to see the imagination as a perceptive faculty. We can use it to see, hear, smell, taste, touch what is not included in the objective reality in this little world that we are handed. When we do this kind of questioning, we decenter the assumptions about what is necessary for education, and we put in their place questions about what learners need. And in doing so, we reveal that we do not have the answers. Behind the screen are students who have experienced a pandemic from diverse social, behind the screen are students who have experienced the pandemic from diverse social locations, from positions of digital poverty, in a near diaspora of living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms turned classrooms. When we respond to their very human experience by aligning outcomes and assessments, by building airtight rubrics, by implementing remote proctoring, all in the name of preserving education, we center our institutional practices, our long traditions, instead of students' realities. If we only take a breath, pause, we might be able to work past things as they have always been done and toward things as they might be otherwise. We have to begin to imagine better digital learning than one which is operational. We have to begin to imagine better digital pedagogies, more critical digital pedagogies, which go farther than the mere implementation of design. And we need to remind ourselves that if our best practices for online learning are leaning too much on unquestioned tradition, we are at the risk of losing our might be and of slipping drowsily into the little world someone else invented for us to occupy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sin, for our talk on humanizing digital pedagogy. It just remind me of one film about, I think, Dead Poets Society or something, where the teacher actually thinks that the students should actually tear upon all the textbooks. Have you heard of that film?
I haven't heard of that, no. But yeah,
And
that's
and
it's
the
a
teacher
similar idea.
calls, yeah. So the teacher calls actually to the student to come out of the traditional classroom. So do you think that this topic about digital pedagogy is more of democratizing the education?
I think so. For me, it always has been, yes. It's always been about making education more available in certain ways. And I don't mean just by making it accessible. I mean giving students more ownership over their own teaching and learning, or over their own learning. And making a classroom where students are creating and producing knowledge rather than just absorbing knowledge. I feel like that's actually, it's more beneficial to students, but it's also more beneficial, just generally speaking, to, I think, society. If we're training students to create knowledge rather than just absorb knowledge, they're better off when they leave college, and we're all better off when they leave college because they're going to create more, and move us forward in new directions, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about proctoring, and we are actually having discussion in our university just towards the end of the COVID, that whether we should implement proctoring or not. And in our university, we actually work with various universities in UK, Scotland, and Ireland. And some of our consultants, they actually opine that we should actually trust our student and we should not implement proctoring.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah. What is your view about that? That means whether
I think one of the first ways that we begin to change education, and the way we begin to make it more equitable, is by trusting students. We start by trusting students. And it's wonderful to hear that that was what you all decided to do, was to trust students instead. And I think that when we do that, we have to begin to find ways to reshape the way that we deal with education. Because if students are taking tests at home, and you can't see them and you can't watch them, then you just have to trust them. And that may change the way you do testing. That you may decide, oh, you know what? This isn't actually nearly as important as other learning that they're doing. And so it's easier to trust in that case because you just take the pressure off. So it can evolve a lot of different kinds of teaching and learning once you decide just to trust students.
I invite our Prof. James, who is our Director of Foundation Education. Prof. James has some question. Prof. James, please open your camera.
Nilesh. Hi, can you hear me, Sean?
Yes.
It's a bit laggy. Okay, I'm James. It's a very Irish sounding name, Sean Michael Morris.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I do a lot of digital teaching, and in terms of the proctoring, it's a question of empathy. Empathy is lost on digital communications and teaching, even personal ones. The number of times I've had a fight with my partner because of a misinterpreted message, because it doesn't have the intonation of empathy. But in terms of the proctoring, we view it as a reward system. The proctoring and any kind of, if a student is cheating, any kind of disciplinary action is not to punish that student, is to reward the students who are well disciplined and honorable. Because if I have an A student coming to me who wants to go to medicine we have a kind of pre-university course, and they say, hey, that guy's getting into medicine and he got an A because he cheated his exams, I feel my A is devalued. So there's an empathy question there. So that needs to be maintained. So how do you restore empathy to the digital world, or how do you create it in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting because when I first tuned in tonight, it's nighttime where I am.
Yep.
And I was watching the introduction and everything. I was reminded of the fact that, there's this whole thing going on that I'm not there to see. And people are feeling emotional about it. People are feeling happy about it. There's a celebration happening, none of which I expected to see at all. But it was really, really important that I did see it, because I recognized, oh, like, this is not just me talking to a screen. This is me talking to people who are over there in Malaysia and in places where I don't know where they are. And this has heft, this has meaning for everyone. The same thing is true when we're teaching online or when we're trying to communicate with anyone digitally. I think we have to remember that those communications are not just lightweight just because they're text. And I think that when we make a mistake or when empathy is lost, it's an opportunity for us to recognize, oh, wait, we maybe need to learn to listen better. And how can I listen better, or how can I communicate better? One of the things that, early on very, very early on, when text messaging first started, and people were criticizing text speech, and the way that students and young people would type back and forth to each other, there was a lot of critique of that, like, well, you should write in complete sentences. And I thought, no, actually what's happening here is the creation of a new way of communicating. And so when we saw like the little, the colon with the parentheses, and that's the smiley face, and now it's gone way beyond that. That to me was not a substitution for language, but rather an attempt to convey something that was happening that words can't capture. So thinking about let's use our language flexibly in digital space when we can't see each other. And I'm an English. I got my degrees in English, so this is in writing. So this is clearly where I end up. But I feel like if we can just let ourselves kind of let down the professional piece a little bit, we can communicate better with our students and just be as human as possible through our communications. Write the way that you talk. More than write the way that you write, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, and your reference to emojis or symbolized emojis, I mean, the younger generation infuse empathy into their communications by the widespread use of emojis. But someone from my generation, I know what about 6 emojis mean. The rest of them I have no clue. And my students, my mentees, send me emojis, and I'm kind of going, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So I have to actually look it up. I have to go and look up what does this emoji mean?
What does this one mean? I know. I have the same thing.
And I sent emojis to people by mistake privately, and they said, "Why are you angry at me?" And I'm kind of going, "Oh, I thought that was a happy emoji." Or
that was happy. Yeah, I didn't know that was.
I didn't know that was.
Yeah, no, it's true. And there are some now that are like, there's been a bunch of emojis that have now been sort of like outlawed, ones you're not supposed to use in polite company anymore. And I was just recently told that you're not supposed to send red hearts to your fellow employees, but you can send green hearts to your fellow employees, because a red heart is like actually love. So it's really interesting. But what I've done is I've tried to, I've taught in fully text spaces, so that I had to learn the way that people were communicating there, and I learned the different ways that emojis were being used, and I imitated that. It was really a process of learning a new language in a lot of ways. Fortunately, it was English and English, but it was still a variety of English that I hadn't been exposed to before. But there again, where there was an absence of understanding and empathy, I looked at it and was like, oh, there's an opportunity for me to just learn here. And I apologized many times for not being empathetic and not understanding things, but
yeah, I've been getting red hearts from my students for the last 2 years, and I'm still very uncomfortable with it. I don't think I'll ever get used to it. Anyway, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sean. Great answer.
Let us look at the chat box. Ajma Abdul Hamid has written that, yes, we should give back the responsibility of learning to students. There is a question from Lajri Latif that, what do you think that whether artificial intelligence can play a role in virtual world, and how it can assist educationists?
So AI is a complicated one. I don't think that we're at a point where AI can do what we think it can do. I think we're still working on that. I used to resist the idea of AI, just generally on principle. And then I realized that there's so many ways in which AI is actually beneficial to us, and that having a sort of support, a digital support for the way that we work with people is actually can be really useful. So I think that there's ways to use it, but I'll answer the question the way that I answer a question about any digital technology, and that is to say that if we want to implement some kind of new digital technology in our teaching, to include students in that conversation. So to bring students in and say, hey, I have this AI, I'd like us to play with this in class. These are the ways that I would like to use it, but I really want your feedback and I want you to help me out trying to figure out how this is implemented, what the effect on learning is. And students are really interested in that kind of thing. I mean, if you include them in the learning process that way, and instead of just say, we're doing this and you're going to get graded on it, they actually really respond well to that. And I think that that's one of the best ways that we can really do that kind of research is in a practical way in a classroom. So implement new tools, go for it, but make sure that you're including students in that conversation is probably what I would say.
You also talked about the learning outcome, and I remember that when we started this suddenly shifting to online learning, and myself and my HOD of e-learning, Mr. Hasnan, we had to take responsibility with our Pro-VC education. Overnight, we took a lot of steps and all. But regarding learning outcome, I remember that maybe within 7 days, there was actually an instruction came from our Malaysian qualifying agency who actually control all universities that we actually can play with the learning outcome. They clearly told that you should not force students to continue with the learning outcome during this difficult hours, and even you can go for about 70% and 30% you can make it in the next semester, or make it in such a way that those parts of the learning outcome overlapping, you can even try to negate it so that it is balanced in some other way. That actually helped a lot, really a lot. Particularly, previously, we never could have mixed the practical skills with our theoretical teaching. There are so much of compartmentalization between the lectures, workshops, seminars, and clinical skills as a medical doctor used to do. But there are a lot of experimentation went on, breaking the boundaries between the lectures and practical, and with the allowance from Malaysian qualifying agency, the lecturers emboldened to mix with lectures with practical skills and did a lot of experimentation. So I feel that really a lot of progressive outlook of accreditation agency is very important in democratizing the education.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I try to focus when I do, I don't teach with learning outcomes, but I teach with key questions. And I ask students to make sure that they are addressing key questions as they're going through a semester or a class, to be thinking about the driving questions behind everything that we're learning. And then usually what happens as an assessment is they do sort of a self-assessment around those questions. To determine, did I ask these questions? Do I have answers to these questions? Did my answers change over the course of the term? And again, I teach education and humanities, so it works really well for me. Sciences, it would still work, but it would have probably different parameters around it. But I completely, that's really wonderful to hear that you were sort of freed from the learning outcome. I think that's really great.
There is another question on about what are your thoughts about virtual tutors?
Virtual tutors meaning actual people or AI tutors? I guess to me, I have two different answers to that. So
I mean, Lajri has written about an example, Sophia, virtual tutors like Sophia, which is in the market.
And I'm not familiar with Sophia, to be honest, but an AI tutor, I would have a difficult time with. And I'm going to actually temper that, because if a tutor is, if an AI tutor is basically programmed to ask a student questions to get them going on toward an answer, then that's great. If an AI tutor is using us like a Socratic method, asking more questions, asking questions, and moving the student along toward the answer, that seems great to me. A lot of, there are virtual tutors who essentially help provide answers to students. And I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to go. Virtual tutors who are like actual people on the other side of the screen, sure, go for it, because I feel like get as much help as you need. But I do think that those tutors need to be trained in certain ways so that they understand pedagogy, so that they're not just saying, oh, well, here's the answer that you needed for your test. That's not learning. So, providing support for a student getting to the answer on their own, I think that's the important piece of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have come to the end of the session. There are no other question. I couldn't see any other question in chat box. So we can end the session. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
For coming to virtually to Malaysia and give your talks. And this is really I mean, a lot of us actually do not think in a way when we deliver the online learning. Maybe your first few slides is eye-opener for many of us when we will taking our online lectures. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Morris, for the wonderful keynote address. That was a very interesting session indeed. I really like the part where you said critical thinking and imagination both rise from this process of asking why. And thank you, Prof. Nilesh, for moderating the session.